Hello friends, welcome to WStv. Recently, in one of its articles, Jacobin magazine has portrayed Martov's role in Russian Revolution in bright light as defender of democracy, while maligning the role of Lenin and Trotsky as its abductor villains. Jacobin is an official publication of DSA, that is Democratic Socialists of America, the left wing of Democratic Party of the US, one of the two pillars of capitalist establishment of the United States. Democratic socialism that Jacobin professes for is nothing but the thin veil to cover up its unflinching support for capitalist democracy instead. In its article that we propose to discuss today, Jacobin has mischievously distorted the very premise of disputes among chief currents of Russian social democracy during Russian Revolution. It has reduced these complex theoretical disputes of historic importance to rubble of formal democracy in abstraction. In the smear campaign against October Revolution and its top leaders, Lenin and Trotsky, this paper of left-wing American elite has presented a mischievous caricature of these disputes as if Lenin and Trotsky had strived to impose a dictatorship upon Russia vis-a-vis Martov, fighting in defense of democracy. According to Jacobin, the disputes between Martov and Lenin Trotsky were centered around the question of democracy, which Jacobin discusses only in abstraction with no further qualification to this concept of democracy. It accuses not only the Soviet state under Lenin and Trotsky of being devoid of democracy, but also the October Revolution itself, from which this state had emanated, of being impoverished in democracy. There can't be anything further from the truth. No surprise that Jacobin does not tell its readers that what Martov and his Mensheviks were advocating and defending was not a workers' democracy but the then existent bourgeois democracy under Kerensky. Martov opposed the very proposal of workers taking to power, postponing the same for infinite future. In opposing October overturn, Martov stood in defense of democracy under Kerensky and against its forcible overthrow through a workers' revolution. His insistence was that the working class was not yet ripe for a revolutionary overturn. Like most of his Bolshevik colleagues, Martov advocated postponement of the revolutionary seizure of power till the point the last layers of the working class gained class consciousness and were ready to participate in the revolution, its politics, and the affairs of the state actively and consciously. Lenin and Trotsky argued that billions of workers and toilers living under oppressive conditions of capitalism can gain political consciousness and necessary political training only after winning of the state power by the working class. So, a political revolution essentially has to precede this general mass awakening of the working class, according to Lenin and Trotsky. Denying this, Martov accused Lenin Trotsky of relying upon the bayonets of the garrison instead of the working class. This illusion, rooted in the outdated, infamous two-stage theory of revolution, has been since thrown to dustbin by the October Revolution itself. Jacobin has taken it out of this trash of history. Martov's infatuation for bourgeois democracy was based upon inability of Mensheviks to understand the peculiarity of Russian Revolution taking place in the 20th century, where the two revolutions, democratic and socialist, had merged into one permanent, uninterrupted revolution, and consequently their driving forces, the worker and the peasant, had also united in action against the reactionary alliance of landlords and capitalists. Stuck up in the old two-stage theory of revolution, Martov entertained the illusion that the turn to rule in Russia was not for the worker but for the capitalist. He thus stood in defense of bourgeois democracy and opposed its overthrow by the working class. Martov first positioned him alongside many, including a section of Bolshevik leaders like Zinoviev and Kamenev, against the organization of workers uprising to capture the power as a task impossible. After the uprising fruitioned, it became successful. Martov opportunistically started accusing the new Soviet power for being devoid of democracy. Alongside Plekhanov and Axelrod, Martov was one of the early proponents of Menchevism in Russia. Mensheviks believed that a successful revolution in Russia would bring capitalists to power and the workers' socialist rule would come at second stage of the revolution, subsequent to this first stage of rule of capitalists. The disputes between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks was centered not around democracy in abstraction, as Jacobin puts it to us, but the character and content of the impending political revolution in Tsarist Russia. Martov and his Menshevik comrades argued that as the impending revolution in Russia is essentially bourgeois democratic in essence, thus Russian capitalist class is its natural leader and it is its turn to rule first before workers take to power in second stage revolution. Repeating Marx by rote, Mensheviks argued that socialist revolutions will take place in advanced Europe first and Russia will turn to socialist revolutions only after full bloom of capitalism inside it. They mechanically imported the division of revolution in two stages, a trait of old European revolutions. Lenin agreed with them as to the character of the Russian Revolution, but disputed that capitalist class may lead it. Criticizing Mensheviks, Lenin said that our revolution is bourgeois democratic in essence. This in no way implies that Russian bourgeoisie is its leader. To Lenin, bourgeois democratic character of the revolution only meant that the overwhelming tasks before the impending revolution were bourgeois democratic in character. Lenin argued that it is not the Russian capitalist but an alliance of workers and peasants that would lead the revolution and would establish itself as dictatorship after success of the revolution. Lenin thus proposed a two-class dictatorship which he termed as democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Ironically, Lenin did not dispute the two-stage conception of revolution till the start of revolution in 1917. Leon Trotsky, co-leader of the Russian Revolution alongside Lenin, disputed the fallacy of this two-stage concept of revolution at very initial stage in 1906. He also underscored the ambiguity in Lenin's formula of two-class dictatorship. Trotsky made it clear that democratic and socialist tasks were the flip sides of the same revolution which had acquired an uninterrupted and permanent character in 20th century. Trotsky claimed that a victorious Russian revolution would put the power directly into the hands of the working class, who, with the aid of peasantry, would complete the democratic tasks side by side, undertaking the socialist tasks under its unitary class dictatorship. Underlying peculiarity of Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky argued in his 1906 book, Russian Revolution Results and Prospects, that Russia would not take to old European path, dividing the revolution in two stages, democracy today, socialism tomorrow. Rather, he claimed that unlike the old European revolutions, the revolution in Russia would be uninterrupted and permanent in essence, that would unite the two revolutions, the democratic and socialist, into one uninterrupted permanent revolution. Giving more clear expression to Lenin's formula of worker-peasant dictatorship, Trotsky argued that it would not be a two-class dictatorship, but a workers' dictatorship, supported and followed by the Russian peasantry. So for him, there was immense role, there was a big role for peasantry, but peasantry was to follow the lead of working class. Working class was to play the crucial leading role in Russian Revolution. Bolshevik formula implied that the task of working class in the first stage of the two-stage of revolution was not to fight for power but for expansion of the democratic space. For this, Martov and his Bolshevik friends had opposed the October overturn, that is, the successful attempt on power. According to them, as the revolution was democratic, it was a turn for the capitalists to rule. Working class must support them to take power, restricting its own role to widening the democratic space under capitalist rule. The thrust of Bolshevik formula was thus not towards the destruction of bourgeois democracy, but instead towards its proliferation to the full. Repeating Bolshevik rot, Martov argued that the working class had not matured enough to take to power. Martov thus accused Lenin Trotsky of destroying his cherished democracy under Kerensky, to be precise, bourgeois democracy, and substituting it with dictatorship of working class through a revolutionary overturn. On a careful scrutiny, early rudiments of this dispute may be traced back to 1903, split of Russian social democracy between Bolshevik and Bolshevik factions of RSDLP. True to their program of two-stage revolution, even in 1903, Bolsheviks had refused to fight for power against the Russian bourgeoisie, rather proposed to support it to take power. They thus proposed a broad-based open mass party. Bolsheviks, though themselves having confused yet more advanced conception of revolution, proposed a close-knit party organized around a center of professional revolutionaries, as propounded by Lenin. These disputes, rooted in two opposing conceptions of Russian revolution, matured gradually into two rival currents of Russian social democracy besides that of Leon Trotsky. Jacobin does not even discuss this. Rather, it cleverly maligns the regime under Lenin Trotsky that ensued from the October Revolution by obliterating the spectacular political divide between it and the later counter-revolutionary rule of Stalin's bureaucracy. Jacobin refuses to see this divide. It projects Stalin's rule not as a counter-revolution to the October Revolution and Soviet power ensuing under it, under Lenin and Trotsky, but as their linear continuity. Eulogizing Martov, Jacobin claims that before 1917, Martov was more prominent figure than Lenin or Trotsky. Here Jacobin omits to mention that before 1917, it were the reformist parties and their leaders that held the sway in mainstream politics, while Bolsheviks remained only a minuscule minority. It was so natural as the revolution itself stood on the margins. With further radicalization of the working class, as the revolution surged, Bolsheviks were on the center stage of politics. Feigning ignorance to all this, Jacobin accuses October Revolution on two counts. Firstly, that the mass of workers had stood aside, did not take part in the revolution and the affairs of the new Soviet state ensuing from it. Secondly, that the revolution was carried out by the soldier, the peasant in uniform, and not by the worker. Jacobin says that though Lenin saw October as workers' revolution, but Martov recognized it as soldiers' uprising. Menshevik Martov and after him Jacobin insist that October Revolution was not a workers' revolution. We have already dwelled on this that the character of Russian Revolution had dual element, a workers' leadership followed by peasantry. Martov, however, conveniently forgets that firstly, during the overturn, the bayonets of the army were put under the control of Military Revolutionary Committee of Petrograd Soviet, dominated by the Bolsheviks. Secondly, the Red Guard units of the Bolshevik Party were the main armed force behind the revolution. And thirdly, it were not soldiers but workers' Soviets that had come up first to be joined later by the soldiers. This way, Bolsheviks ensured that the barrack followed the lead of the factory and soldier of the worker. Jacobin tells us that Martov belonged to anti-war minority and internationalist faction of Mensheviks, that he was among the organizers of Zimmerwald anti-war conference and helped organize internationalist left from the ruins of Second International. He established Naše Slovo, Our Word, which Lenin recognized as leading anti-war paper in Europe. Despite his service to anti-war movement, Martov remained a Menshevik, adherent of two-stage theory of revolution and an ardent supporter of democracy under capitalists, which Jacobin conveniently forgets. His past associated with the Jewish workers' organization, the Bund, in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, the only mass socialist party of his time, remains to his credit, but it cannot cover up the Menshevik past of Martov and his political crime in opposing October Revolution and his support to bourgeois democracy under Kerensky. Jacobin also highlights that from 1900 to 1903, Martov was prominent organizer of monthly newspaper Iskra and its smuggling into Russian cities. In his 1911 pamphlet, Rescuers or Wreckers, Martov rightly opposed bank robberies, money laundering, and forgeries, etc., as being committed on an official resolution of the Bolshevik Party. Jacobin, however, omits that Bolshevik Party itself turned against it and rejected this path later. Most important is Martov's role in October uprising. He actively opposed the uprising and walked out of All Russia Congress of Soviets. Trotsky told the leaving Martov, "Go where you belong to from now on, into the dustbin of history." The article cites an event when Ivan Akulov, Viborg worker, said to Martov while he was leaving the Congress, "We thought that at least Martov will be with us." Martov replied to Akulov, "One day you will realize the crime you are taking part in." So, for Martov, to participate in the revolutionary uprising was a crime, and supporting the capitalist government of Kerensky was a matter of pride. To be noted, Akulov was not a soldier but a worker to whom Martov was replying to. Jacobin tells us that later Akulov fell victim to Stalin's terror. Playing an intrigue upon its readers, Jacobin accuses the October Revolution for the counter-revolutionary crimes of Stalin's bureaucracy against the revolution itself. Akulov was purged by Stalin itself shows how the regime under Stalin had strangled the revolution. But Jacobin has no eyes to see the truth. It plays intrigue after intrigue. Jacobin tells us that in November 1917, Martov wrote in a letter to Pavel Axelrod, "Here is the situation. It is tragic. The most terrible thing that could have been expected has taken place. The seizure of power by Lenin and Trotsky." So, for Martov, the seizure of power by Lenin and Trotsky in a revolution was the most terrible thing, as it was backed by the bayonets of armed peasantry. But the capitalist rule under Lvov or Kerensky was democracy for Martov. Jacobin accuses the October Revolution of lacking a mass character, but in the next breath, Martov himself is quoted by Jacobin, quote unquote, I understand that we are facing, after all, a victorious uprising of the proletariat. That is, almost the entire proletariat stands behind Lenin and expects social liberation through the overturn. What more is needed, Messrs. Jacobin? Here is your beloved Martov deposing himself that entire proletariat stood behind Lenin and it sees its liberation in the revolution. So a revolution is there with total mass support of the proletariat behind Lenin, yet opposed by Martov. Jacobin refers to a second letter by Martov to Axelrod, written in December 1917, where he articulated his fears about where such a revolution was headed. Although the mass of the workers, quote unquote, although the mass of the workers are behind Lenin, his regime is increasingly becoming a terror regime, not of the proletarians but of the sans-culottes, a motley mass of armed soldiers, red guards, and sailors. Martov went on to make another prediction. A regime of terror, the trampling of civil liberties and the abuse of the Constituent Assembly in the name of class dictatorship is fundamentally killing the rudiments of the democratic education acquired by the people over 8 months. That is between February and October, and is preparing the most fertile ground for every kind of Bonapartism. Martov is aggrieved with the disbanding of the Constituent Assembly and calls it Bolshevik terrorism. What else can be expected from a person who sees democracy in the rule of capitalists under Kerensky and terror in the rule of proletariat under Lenin Trotsky? Jacobin quotes Martov's 1918 pamphlet titled Down with the Death Penalty, where Martov criticizes the restoration of death penalty by Lenin. The provisional government had first abolished death penalty but then had restored it in the summer of the same year on the front. Still, Mensheviks continued their support for Kerensky's government. Immediately on taking power, after taking this power by Bolsheviks, Bukharin abolished it again. But Lenin restored the death penalty, claiming that the same was a weapon for suppression of enemies of the revolution. Martov opposed this. Jacobin quotes Martov, having eliminated tens of thousands of people without trial, the Bolsheviks have now advanced to judicial executions. This bloody debauchery is being committed in the name of socialism, in the name of the doctrine which proclaimed the brotherhood of working people as the highest goal of humanity. This debauchery is being carried out in your name, Russian worker. But this went unheard among the class-conscious workers of Petrograd, who knew that the state is nothing but a class instrument of repression in the hands of a class against another. And it was for the first time the turn for the workers, who had always been victim of this debauchery, was there. They were not ready to miss the opportunity. They rejected the calls of Mensheviks, including that of the Martov, as naked betrayal to the cause of revolution. Defending Martov, Jacobin declares that Martov opposed separation of ends from means. This article quotes a book written by Martov in 1919 titled Word Bolshevism, in which he argued that socialism is possible with maximum development of the self-activity of working class. He opposed terror and bureaucracy. There can be no two opinions or views about it. But how to create the conditions for this maximum development of self-activity of the working class? Martov differed with Lenin on this. Lenin clarified that this activity cannot be developed to its max except through capture of political power by the working class. Martov denied it. After accusing Lenin Trotsky of having fetish for bureaucratic methods, Jacobin admits that Trotsky himself had opposed bureaucracy and bureaucratic methods in his 1923 work, The New Course. He, however, deliberately omits to mention Lenin's own struggle against bureaucracy even before that. In his article, Better Fewer but Better, Lenin had mounted an uncompromising assault against bureaucracy and has given call for its destruction. In her 1918 pamphlet, The Russian Revolution, Rosa Luxemburg had also expressed the similar views. Bureaucracy, however, was not a choice for the revolution, but an imposition by the historic conditions in which Russian Revolution was taking shape. The backwardness of the economic development of Russia, dominance of medievalism, scarcity of resources, archaic means of production, minuscule numerical strength of working class, dependence on peasantry, immense destruction and war weariness during civil war, and finally and most significantly the isolation of the revolution in Russia because of delay in revolutions in the West were the prime factors, among others, responsible for development of bureaucracy in Russia. To highlight the absence of mass character of October Revolution, Jacobin quotes 1922 book by Karl Radek. Quote unquote, the Revolutionary Military Committee had taken power in the name of the Soviets of Workers and Soldiers of Petrograd. Jacobin quotes Trotsky next. It says, at the very moment of the revolution, Trotsky addressed an emergency meeting of the Petrograd Soviet, remarking that, quote unquote, as he was speaking, the population of the city slept peacefully and did not know that at this time one power was replaced by another. This, for Jacobin, is the proof of the revolution going over the heads of the masses without their participation. Jacobin probably would have been satisfied of the mass character of the revolution had the entire population, not only of Petrograd but of whole of Russia, would have indulged in some sort of voting democratically, or each one firing at least a single shot. That is laughable. Jacobin picks up another Menshevik, Raphael Abramovich, to depose in favor of non-worker peasant character of the revolution. It says Martov's close friend, Raphael Abramovich, wrote about this sadly and ironically in his last book, The Soviet Revolution, 1917 to 1939. Quote unquote, the proletarian revolution was accomplished while the working masses of the capital stood by passively. The struggle for the world socialist revolution was won by war-weary peasant lads in soldiers' and sailors' uniforms. Jacobin deduces that Abramovich describes the role in Russia and other countries of a temporary new class of peasants and soldiers instead of workers. When Poland attacked Russia, Martov supported Russia's right to defend itself as he had no other choice before him. He, however, opposed the Soviet Red Army's military incursion into Poland later. Martov left Russia in 1920 to discourage German left from joining Comintern, the Third International. In 1921, Martov founded the Menshevik paper Socialisticky Vestnik, the Socialist Courier, that continued to direct its attacks against October Revolution for the next 40 years. Martov died at 49 in 1923 in Germany of tuberculosis contracted inside Tsar's prison during his incarceration during revolution. The Jacobin article attempts to draw a direct lineage between October Revolution and 681,692 executions and sending of millions to gulags during the Stalinist terror purges of 1937 and 38. It links famines in Ukraine and Kazakhstan and millions dying in Holodomors to the defective workings of October Revolution. In nutshell, it does everything to smear October Revolution and its leadership. True to its class affiliation, Jacobin maligns socialist revolution and makes every attempt to discredit it. What else can be expected of a publication of left wing of Democratic Party of the US that has stood support for such long period to its regime and a partner in its crime from Gaza to Ukraine? Good night, friends. See you again.